Good evening. Good evening, everyone. If we can just find our seats, we can't hear. How's that? I want to make sure we're going to be loud enough. How's the sound? That's, I think, a little better? Okay. Ilana has a loud voice. Wonderful to see so many of you, new friends, old wise friends. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you, both in person and online, to those on our live stream. My name is Karen Collins. I'm honored to serve as the Director of Canada for the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. The Shalom Hartman Institute is a pluralistic think tank and educational center for the Jewish people. Our goal is to enrich and elevate Jewish life in Israel and North America, and to support leaders, institutions, and communities by generating ideas that offer insights to the challenges they face. At Hartman, we believe that ideas have the power to create change. At this unprecedented moment for Israel and the Jewish people, our work at the Hartman Institute has adapted. We are supporting leaders by helping them make sense of the moment, respond to questions around what it means for us as a Jewish people, and for us here in Canada, consider how the unique Canadian landscape shapes this conversation. This evening's program is a testament to this. In collaboration with Holy Blossom and Beth Tzedek congregation, Ilana Stein-Hain will offer ideas to help us at this moment. I want to thank both Holy Blossom and Beth Tzedek for their partnership, and to each of you for being here to learn with us. We hope that you will continue to turn to the Hartman Institute, to our podcasts, our articles, our programs for trusted thought leadership. And I want to offer a special welcome to our teen leaders, both the Toronto cohort of the Hartman Teen Fellowship, who are spending the year studying big ideas with Hartman, along with 200 fellow teens from across North America, and all the other teens who have joined us this evening. Following our session, our teens are invited to gather in the Enkin boardroom on the main floor for a special debrief with Ilana. At Hartman, we often consider the idea of homeness. And at this moment, both as Canadians and as a Jewish community, this is particularly poignant for us as we consider what it means to call both Canada and Israel home. And it is with this in mind that I acknowledge that the lands on which we gather from today are a shared home, shared with the people who were here, caring for this land and its inhabitants before us. And we acknowledge that Holy Blossom Temple is hosted on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Ojibwa, Chippewa, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. And we are grateful for the opportunity to gather on this land and strengthen our community through this gift of learning. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Yael Splansky, Holy Blossom Senior Rabbi, and a member of Hartman's Rabbinic Leadership Initiative, to say a few words. And following our learning with Ilana, we will be honored to welcome Rabbi Friar Bodzin to help us conclude the evening.
Shalom, everyone. I find that what the Jewish people is experiencing now is less likely to be accurately described in political analysis and more likely to be accurately described through poetry. And I know Ilana Stein-Hain appreciates a good poem. So in her honor, I've brought this to kick off the evening by Leah Goldberg, The Day After, 1957. The green is very green today. The gray is very gray today. There's a little black, but no white in the city. What is stormy is very stormy today. And the past today is very past. And there's a little future, but there's no present in the air. It's still so hard to breathe. It's still so hard to think in the face of this winding wind. And it's really not so simple to wait. The storm brushes against my eyes, every moment shatters, but the green is very green today. Thank you for being here. I find it's gatherings like this that help most of all. It feels good to gather in a sacred place for sacred study. We thank Dr. Rhonda Wilansky and Israel Ben Yishai for supporting tonight's learning. Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain is the Rosh Beit Midrash and a senior research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, where she serves as lead faculty, engages in research and curriculum development, and consults on the content of lay and professional leadership programs. A widely admired teacher and scholar, Ilana is passionate about bringing rabbinic thought into conversation with contemporary life. To this end, she created Talmud from the Balcony, an occasional learning seminar exposing the big ideas, questions, and issues motivating rabbinic discussions. She is the author of a new book, Circumventing the Law, Rabbinic Perspectives on Legal Loopholes and Integrity, which uses loopholes as a lens for understanding rabbinic views about law and ethics. Ilana also co-hosts For Heaven's Sake. I'm sure many of you are following this very popular bi-weekly podcast with Rabbi Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi, exploring contemporary issues related to Israel and the Jewish world. Dr. Stein-Hain earned her doctorate in religion at Columbia University and is an alumna of the Yeshiva University Graduate Program in Advanced Talmudic Studies, as well as the Consortium in Jewish Studies and Legal Theory Graduate Fellowship at Cardozo School of Law. She also served for 8 years as a clergy member of the Upper West Side of Manhattan at both Lincoln Square Synagogue and the Jewish Center. She has taught at the Wagner School at NYU and sits on the board of Sefaria, the game-changing online library of Jewish texts. She lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan with her family. I first met Dr. Stein-Hain more than 10 years ago when she came to Toronto to teach for the Lola Stein Institute, a joint initiative of the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Toronto Heschel School, with the goal of educating Jewish educators. And I was blown away not only by the material that she brought to teach, but by how she taught it. Everyone here knows that when it comes to teaching, the messenger is the message. Ilana brings her own curiosity, her own humor, her own passion for text, and respect for every learner, no matter what corner of the Jewish world they might come from. Throughout 4 years of study with Hartman's Rabbinic Fellowship, I had a chance to study with Ilana Stein-Hain. She was, by my colleagues and me, universally admired. Whenever we entered her study hall, we knew we were in for a treat. And we prepared to receive a gift, a slice of our sacred heritage, handed down through the generations of rabbis and scholars and curated masterfully, skillfully by this, our teacher. Friends, our world has been turned upside down, and we depend upon thought leaders like Dr. Stein-Hain to help us find our bearings, to find the map, to find our pathway to understanding, and ultimately, with God's help, to a way forward. This is why we have come tonight. Dr. Stein-Hain's topic, moral responsibilities in times of war, has come not a moment too soon. So let the light that she shines on rabbinic texts and Jewish ideas guide our steps now, as we pray each morning when dawn's light first arrives. Baruch atah Adonai, Yotzer HaMeorot. Praised are you, O God, creator of the luminaries.
Okay, friends. First of all, I want to thank the rabbis of Holy Blossom, of Beth Tzedek. I want to thank my colleague, Karen Collins, who makes everything Hartman happen in Canada. And I want to thank the people who so generously sponsored tonight. And I think that that piece in the poem that you read, Rabbi Splansky, during my eulogy, thank you for that. I got to start recording these. That piece in the poem that says that there's no present, it's hard to think. I really felt that when you were reading it. I feel that that is, for many of us, what we are experiencing. It may be hard to think because we have a lot of messaging coming at us, but I also think that it's hard to think because we are in the midst of a tremendum. We are facing an abyss. How do you talk about moral responsibility in a time of war as people are still reeling from the trauma of October 7th, and they don't know how they're going to survive it? How do you talk about morality in a time of war with enormous numbers of civilians in Gaza dying? How do you talk about moral responsibility in a time of war during a sham trial of genocide in the International Court of Justice against Israel? How do you talk about morality in a time of war when you are facing multiple enemies who have no such interest in any such topic? And how do you talk about morality in a time of war where we are doing many countries, European and Arab, a favor and are only getting criticized for it in many corners? So the answer I'm going to suggest is with a lot of humility, with the knowledge that you are asking people to do things that they may not be able to do, and with the knowledge that people may disagree with you and disagree with you vehemently. And I'm going to say I'm expecting it. And I think that's okay. Because in order to create a present, we actually have to stop and talk about who we want to be as Jews, who we want to be as people, and that is going to entail disagreement. So I want to give us permission for that. I'm not scared of it. I hope you're not scared of it either. We love threes in Judaism. It's odd, isn't it? How much we love threes in Judaism? It's odd. But we do, right? We say, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. The world stands on three things. We love threes, right? So I'm going to give you, what I'm going to suggest is 3 building blocks of a moral framework that I have found helpful and useful and compelling for thinking about responsibility in a time of war. And I'm going to share those 3 building blocks with you. And those 3 building blocks are kinship ethics, that's the first, and the foundation. International law, that's the next, built on top of it, and a realistic shared humanity built on top of that. They are going in that order not because what's highest is the most important or because what's foundational can stand alone. They're going in that order because I think sequentially, in order to get to each in a responsible way, you need the one before it. And so I'm going to spend some time tonight looking with you at each one of these building blocks: kinship ethics, international law, and a realistic shared humanity, in an effort to try not to decide, was this the right move in the right moment that happened 2 months ago or last week, but in an effort to provide a moral framework, a lens through which to think about the topics of morality right now, okay? There will be time for question and answer. Do not worry. So let's start with kinship ethics. So I want to start with the following, which I think for many years for Jews was something obvious, and I think is less and less obvious in a freer and freer world, in a world where we inhabit and have multiple identities, but that is that we belong to a people. Sure, we belong to humanity, and we belong to our group of co-violinists, or other people who like to play pickleball, or other people who voted for, I don't know enough about the politics here, and also meaning that I can say something and get away with it, you know what I mean? But our kin, our family, is the Jewish people. And when our kin and our family is the Jewish people, it means that what happens to the Jewish people happens to me. It is not something that is only 6,000 miles away. It is something that happens to me. The political philosopher Martha Nussbaum talks about in her book Political Emotions, which I highly recommend, the notion that compassion is predicated upon a sense of these people upon whom I should have compassion matter to me. If they don't matter to me, it's going to be difficult to get me to have compassion for them. But if they do matter to me because they are me and I am them, it will not be hard to garner that compassion. So that's, I guess, non-controversial enough, even as we all know it's not so simple either. But kinship ethics says the following: everybody in the world should be protected, but whose duty is it to protect them? Kinship ethics suggests I have a greater responsibility to my family to protect and look out for the fate and destiny of my family than I do to look out for someone else's family. That is not because my children are any more human than their children. It is because I have a different kind of moral responsibility to my own family. I do not have that heightened moral responsibility to my family because I am immoral or amoral. I have that responsibility because I am moral, and I understand what I need to do that others will not do for my family. If, God forbid, my child is suffering and someone else's child is suffering, if I can only save one, we all know who I should save, because I'm that person's guardian. I think that kinship ethics has to be at the basis of any conversation of morality in war. And I mean that both in the sense that if the Jewish people is our kin, is our family, we owe them a very high degree of responsibility, of protection. Our moral obligations to them is heightened more than to other people. Did we just get a little more controversial? I really believe it, okay? Kinship ethics essentially says, I have to protect my own first. Now, it's complicated because in the state of Israel, in some ways, kinship ethics is actually a kind of membership ethic, right? There's such a thing as human rights, and there's such a thing as membership rights. Kinship ethics say membership rights matter. When you live in a country that is a country of all its citizens, then all of those citizens get those same membership rights, or should, right? So in Israel, this isn't just about Jews, nor should it be just about Jews. It should be about who are the members of this country, who are the citizens of this country, and we actually, as a country, owe them all rights beyond what we owe those who are not citizens of our country. So you have from the family unit, my child versus someone else's child. You have to the Jewish peoplehood unit, our responsibility for fellow Jews or members of the Jewish people versus those who are outside. And then you have a country or a nation state, which maybe is actually the second tier because it's smaller, but you understand, right? Kinship ethics. I want to sum up kinship ethics, though, with the following phrase from prophets, from the Navi. There's a description in the second book of Kings where Elisha the prophet wants to give something back to a Shunammite woman who has been hosting him every time he comes to town. And he says to her, if you look in number 1 on your sheet, he says to her, it says, Vayomer lo, this was actually Elisha said to someone who was working for him, Emor na eleha, please say to her, Hine charadet elenu et kol hacharada hazot, you've done so much for us, ma la'asot lach, what can we do for you? Hayesh ledaber lach el hamelech, do you want us to put in a good word with the king? O el sar hatzava, do you want us to put in a good word with the general? Vatomer, and she says 4 words that I think should be inscribed on all of our hearts. Vatomer, she says, Betoch ami anochi yoshavet, which literally means I sit within my nation. What she essentially means is I don't need anything, I'm fine. I'm with my people, I'm taken care of. But I want to use that as a motto of a moral responsibility of ours as North American Jews. Betoch amenu anachnu yoshvim. We are immersed within our people. What does it look like on a daily basis to be immersed in what's going on with our people? Yes, it's following the news. Yes, it's lobbying. Yes, it's sending resources. Yes, it's going on missions. But I want to say one other piece that I think will probably be controversial, but I'm okay with that, especially because I don't see the people who are looking on the screen, and the rest of you, we have to see each other afterwards, so we'll be fine, right? And I'm in Canada. How dangerous can it get, right? Or maybe I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that. That was silly. I shouldn't say that. Some people over the last year and over the last years have developed a knee-jerk posture towards Israel that is critical. That is the posture that people have. I don't like the government. I'm scared of the theocracy. I'm scared of the ultranationalism. I'm angry about the Supreme Court. We have developed a knee-jerk orientation that is critical by default, critical by default. And trust me, there's what to criticize. But I am wondering if betoch amenu anachnu yoshvim, living among our people, should that be our default? It doesn't mean that it can't be part of the conversation, but what is our default? I have seen rabbis taken to task for not being critical enough of Israel and for only posting things about the hostages and only posting things about Betoch amenu anachnu yoshvim. We must be within our people. It is a moral orientation for a traumatized family to which we are responsible more than we are responsible to anyone else. That's the bottom layer. Let's go up a notch. Oh, actually, let's do one more thing, because there's this great Gemara and it's beautiful, and you'll remember it because it's so beautiful. Take a look at number 3. Part of the reason that us being within our nation is important is not just for our own moral stance, but because it actually elevates the feelings and the sense of survival and possible thriving of our people across the pond, right? There's a beautiful Gemara, there's a beautiful piece of Talmud that dramatizes this in just a magnificent way, especially as Israel sort of presents itself as us against the world, we can do it, we've got this, right? To an extent, right? Take a look in number 3. Rabbi Chia bar Abba chalash. Rabbi Chia, the son of Abba, got sick. Al legabe Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan came to visit him. Amar le, Rabbi Yochanan said to him, Chavivin alecha yisurin, are you happy to be so sick or suffering, right? Don't ask, this is for another time. That area in the Talmud is talking about the possibility that suffering is something that could be helpful to you. Let's not do that now, okay? I often say let's not do that ever, but let's not do that now. Amar le, so he answered, Lo hein velo scharan. I don't like the pain, and I don't like the reward that I'm going to get from the pain. You see what I mean? That's the background. Amar le, so Rabbi Yochanan says to him, Hav li yadach, give me your hand. Yav le'yadeh, so he gave him his hand, v'okmeh, and he lifted him up. And then Rabbi Yochanan, the one who had helped, Rabbi Yochanan chalash. We might call this contagious, right? Rabbi Yochanan, the guy who helped him up, then gets sick. Maybe there's a few years in between, or maybe it's you had COVID, I helped you up, and now I have COVID, right? Rabbi Yochanan chalash. Rabbi Yochanan got sick. Alagabe Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina, another rabbi, came to him. Amar lei, and he said to him, Chavivin alecha yisurin. Do you like having this suffering? Amar lei, he says, Lo hein v'lo scharan. I don't like the suffering, and I don't like the reward that I'm going to get for it. Amar lei, so he says, Havli yadach, give me your hand. Yav le'yadeh v'okmeh. So Rabbi Yochanan gave his hand to Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Chanina lifted him up. And then the Gemara says, as you know, it's either a question that the Talmud would ask, or it's a question that, like, my 10-year-old would ask. And I mean that in the greatest way. The ability to sort of stand back and say, hey, why? Why? Right? So the Gemara says, Amai, why did Rabbi Yochanan need Rabbi Chanina to lift him up? Lokim Rabbi Yochanan l'nafshe. Rabbi Yochanan can lift himself up. After all, didn't he lift that other person up? He can figure it out, right? So the Gemara says, Amri, well, this is what we say. Ein chavush matir atzmo mi beit ha'asurim. A person who is imprisoned cannot take themselves out of prison. They need someone else to take their hand and take them out. Even if they're strong, even if they usually can do this for other people, they need someone to take their hand. That is kinship ethics. Next level upwards, international law. I am not an international law expert. What I am is somebody who has what I hope is a deep moral compass, a working moral compass. What I hope can tell the difference between false claims and real claims, but also someone who knows that I don't know about everything that's going on the ground at all times, like none of us do. I heard from Professor Idit Shafran Gittleman, and here I want to highly recommend, she's a professor of international law from Tel Aviv University. Hartman is running a series, a 3-part series online about ethics of war. The first one was on Monday. The second one, I think, is today, and I forget when the third one is. The third one, it's coming, okay? So I would highly recommend it because they're actually going to go through all the international legal pieces. But one of the things that this professor did is she said, look, you have on 2 different edges of the spectrum. On the one, you have pacifism. And the other edge of the spectrum, you have moral realism, okay? Both of these essentially say morality and war can't really coexist. Pacifism says you can't really fight a war morally, so don't fight it. Better to just hold back, okay? Moral realism says, don't bother me with morality right now. I need to win. That's what needs to happen. Both of those deny the possibility of being moral or having some sort of moral code during a time of war. Just war theory, or international law about war, lives in between those 2 poles. It suggests that as ugly as war is, there are ways to fight more justly and less justly. Now, international law, and this is the second layer, does not get erased by October 7th. It neither gets erased by October 7th because the trauma is so terrible, nor do we have to assume that international law is being completely shunted aside because there are terrible statistics of the dead in Gaza. I'm going to say that again. International law is neither canceled by October 7th because of the trauma and the need to win, nor should it be assumed to have been completely ignored merely because there are very high statistics of civilian casualties in Gaza. And I'll explain what I mean. The 2 central tenets of international law around just war, not just fighting a war that is just to fight, but fighting it in a just way, are the principle of distinction, distinguishing between military and civilians, or in this case, because Hamas is not a military of a known country entity, it is not a recognized military, involved and uninvolved people, being able to distinguish between those people and trying to set your sights on eradicating the involved and trying as little as possible to hurt the uninvolved or kill the uninvolved. And proportionality. Proportionality being, I'm going to say this from my notes because I want to be very careful, foreseen but unintended harm must be proportionate to the military advantage achieved. Foreseen but unintended harm must be proportionate to the military advantage achieved. Let's look at each of these for a minute. The principle of distinction. If you really dig into it, what the principle of distinction means is that you are trying as much as possible not to kill non-combatant children in Gaza. Yes, I said non-combatant children. I am sad that I said non-combatant children, but if I did not have a family member who told me firsthand about an 8-year-old putting an explosive device on his tank, I would not have to say non-combatant children. But I do have to say that. Non-combatant children in Gaza are uninvolved, just as uninvolved as Jewish children in Yerushalayim. And they are not legitimate military targets. Here's the harder one. Even people who celebrate October 7th, but are not involved in holding someone hostage in their house, or not involved in carrying out attacks, even those people, not legitimate military targets. We do, because of the trauma in Israel, hear a lot of people talking about how there's no such thing as an innocent civilian in Gaza. This is not true from the perspective of international law. I can't tell you that the 75% rate of who supported October 7th, I don't know if that's right or if it's 100%, I don't know. But supporting October 7th doesn't actually make someone involved. Being involved makes them involved. I think that is the hardest part about the principle of distinction in this war. The principle of proportionality. What this means is, if there are people who are uninvolved, who will get killed in pursuit of a legitimate military target, if that military target warrants the loss of even innocent life, it is legitimate under international law to pursue that military target. The loss of life is terrible and sad and terrible and tragic. And when it's done for the pursuit of a military aim that warrants that kind of tragedy and unfortunate element, it is completely legal. It is completely legal. And I think that is a very hard thing to swallow. And I think what's also difficult to swallow is that there's another aspect of proportionality that comes in here in the conversation, which is, what is the role of the need to deter Hamas from doing this again, in terms of how Israel weighs what targets to pursue and how, and what collateral damage is worth it? What is the deterrence needed for Hezbollah and for the Houthis and for whoever else Iran decides to send over? What do they need to see happen in Gaza for them to hold back and say, hey, we don't want that to happen to us? Does that factor in to proportionality? The fact that this is an urban warfare scenario where we have an enemy that is actually trying to take advantage of the possibility of using uninvolved people in order to cover themselves How do we take that into account in proportionality, right? And on the other side, and this is going to lead us to our third building block, but on the other side, where does the risk of starvation and disease spreading like wildfire in Gaza, how does it play into this? Is that something that you need to worry about from a legal perspective? Or let me ask it better. Is that something you need to worry about from a moral perspective? And we're going to get to that in number 3. But I want to say that what I'm trying to put on the table is these principles of distinction and proportionality, they go together, and people are not going to agree on what is considered proportionate. Just because you disagree on what's considered proportionate does not mean that Israel is committing genocide. Okay? That ability to argue, but everyone holds proportionality and distinction between combatants and non-combatants, or involved and uninvolved, as a principle, that is the baseline of this moral framework. Then you argue about what's considered proportionate, what's not considered proportionate. If you have everybody agreeing at least that you need those two things, then you can argue about the details. But that is a moral stance so long as you have that principle, in my opinion. It's interesting, one of the things that's really nice about the Hartman Institute, and I kind of learned, I learned it on my way, was that so much has happened in Hartman, Jerusalem, that people here often don't know. Like, has anybody here ever heard of the Gavison-Maidan Agreement? Ruth Gavison and Professor Ruth Gavison, Aleh Shalom, law professor at Hebrew University, and Rabbi Yaakov Maidan, one of the Roshei Yeshiva, one of the yeshiva heads of Har Etzion, of Gush, they sat together for years at Hartman and hammered out an agreement for secular and religious Jews what that partnership can look like in Israel. Legally, what's a legal framework? At Hartman. They spent years at Hartman doing that. Now, what happened when they introduced it to the world? Has anybody here ever heard of the Gavison-Maidan Agreement? Right. Another thing that happened at Hartman, Jerusalem, is that the new IDF Code of Ethics in the year 2000 was written at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. And the new IDF Code was replacing the 1994 IDF Code. And this I find really intriguing. The 1994 version of the IDF Code, known as Purity of Arms or Tohar Neshek in Hebrew, was written mostly by practitioners, meaning by people who had served as generals in the field. The 2000 code was written very much by philosophers, actually. And so the differences are really quite interesting, right? Like when you get a little distance. One major question that came up as a point of contention between these two was the degree to which Israeli soldiers have to endanger their own lives to protect civilians, enemy civilians. The degree to which Israeli soldiers have to endanger their own lives to protect enemy civilians. The 1994 version, Asa Kasher in number 5 and Amos Yadlin are two people who really represent the spirit of the IDF in 1994. And it goes like this. One major issue is the priority given to the duty to minimize casualties among combatants of the state when they are engaged in combat acts against terror. Right? So they say, here's something we need to talk about. And of course, it's somewhat in response to the new IDF code. We want to talk about prioritizing actually trying to make sure that our combatants have fewer casualties, that our soldiers have fewer casualties. According to the ordinary conception underlying the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, the former, meaning any soldier, have a lighter package of state duties than the latter, meaning any soldier is less protectable than any non-combatant, which means an Israeli soldier has fewer rights to protection than a Gazan uninvolved person. That's kind of the standard. Michael Walzer, Just and Unjust Wars, he wrote the book on it. That's the standard, okay? We reject such conceptions, they say, because we consider them to be immoral. A combatant is a citizen in uniform. In Israel, often he or she is a conscript or on reserve duty. His blood is as red and thick as that of the citizens who are not in uniform. By the way, I would not have put it that way. Going back to kinship ethics, I would have put it as the state's duties towards those people is the same as the state's duties towards its non-combatant citizens, okay? I think that's a mistake because now you're trying to compare whose blood is redder of human beings. There's no such thing. No such thing. His life is as precious as the life of anyone else. No one's discounting that, right? A democratic state may send him to a battlefront only because it has a duty to defend its citizens, and it cannot do this without some of them defending the others, within the framework of a just system of conscription and reserve duty. The state ought to have a compelling reason for jeopardizing a citizen's life, whether or not he or she is in uniform. That was the 1994 Code of Ethics. The 1994 Code of Ethics is we don't want chayalim, we don't want IDF soldiers dying in order to, I would say, save people on the other side. It didn't quite say it like that, but what it did say is we want to protect the lives of our soldiers. Go back to number 4. Avishai Margalit and Michael Walzer are representative of the later version of the spirit of the IDF, and I would say Moshe Halbertal is as well. And one thing that I think is incredibly powerful, and if you listen to Walzer, Walzer is the just war theorist in America from the 20th century. He was at Princeton for a very long time. He wrote the book on this, Just and Unjust Wars. He argues that any combatant has fewer rights to protection than any civilian. That is his argument. And he has said, and I heard him recently say, I would never, ever write anything about Israel in this regard without an Israeli co-author. And so he writes with Avishai Margalit, who was a professor at Hebrew University, who espouses the same perspective. And I think that's incredibly powerful in terms of betoch amenu anachnu yoshvim. We are among our people. He says, I'm not an armchair ethicist, okay? They argue differently. Number 4, the most significant and sensitive claim can be summed up as follows, that the safety of our soldiers, he's talking about what other people say, precedes the safety of their civilians. This claim is mistaken and dangerous. The decisive means of limiting the scope of warfare is marking a clear line between combatants and non-combatants. This is the only relevant distinction that all sides must agree to. Terror, in its essence, is an evil attempt to blur this distinction in that it turns civilians into a legitimate target. When fighting against terror, one must not imitate it. The ability to harm and to damage is what turns combatants into a legitimate target. You heard that? The ability to harm and to damage is what turns combatants into a legitimate target in times of war. Those who cannot harm and damage, meaning non-combatants, are all presumed innocent. To what degree of danger is it permissible to expose Israeli soldiers? The guideline, in our opinion, should be this. In an area where there are civilians, they should battle with the same level of concern and consideration as if the civilians on the other side were Israeli civilians. In other words, civilians are civilians are civilians. So we have 2 positions here on a really important moral question. I would like, by a raise of hands, and you at home, you can raise your hands too, but we're not going to see you, right? Okay. I'd like, by a raise of hands, who here feels morally compelled by the Kasher and Yadlin that says our soldiers should not have to sacrifice their lives in order to save enemy civilians if it comes to that? Who here finds that morally compelling? I want to ask a different question. Is there anybody here, I really mean this, is there anybody here who has a family member in Gaza right now who did not raise their hand? Of the people who raised their hand, how many people have a family member fighting in Gaza right now? Yeah. It's interesting, right? I used to be a big Halbertal Margalit Walzer person until my family member ended up fighting in Gaza. And then I was like, these guys. Who here feels morally compelled by Margalit and Walzer? By the idea, civilians are civilians are civilians, combatants are combatants are combatants. This is a legitimate moral argument, my friends. It's great to have this argument. And guess what? We don't know who's right. What we know is that everybody here in this room has a moral compass and is trying to work with it. And I want that to just be an example of having arguments over how proportionality should work and how distinction should work does not mean that everything is awry. Having arguments means you're actually wedded to the principles and you're trying to figure it out, okay? I hope we can do more of that in life, much more of that. So that's my second tier. Kinship ethics. Oh, I want to say one more thing. Because this was also, I was listening to Edith Shafran-Gittleman, and she said something that I thought was really interesting. Margalit and Walzer and Halbertal would say to you, you have to fight in Gaza, like the civilians in Gaza, the same way you'd fight in Tel Aviv if the civilians were Israelis. So what does the Yadlin Kasher, what do they say, right? Meaning, it's like if civilians are civilians are civilians, you have to, it can only be considered proportionate if you would kill the same number of civilians in Tel Aviv to hit that military target, right? Civilians are civilians are civilians. So what would Kasher say? So it's actually interesting. She suggested, not that she was suggesting what Kasher would say, but it made sense to me. She said, instead of the Tel Aviv test, how about the Paris test? Meaning, the state has a greater package of duties, kinship ethics, membership ethics, has a greater package of duties to its own people, its own civilians, its own combatants, than it does to others, right? So it doesn't really make sense to say you have to fight in Gaza as though those civilians were Israeli citizens and you were in Tel Aviv. She said, maybe you could do like the Paris test. Would it be considered proportionate? Is it something you would do if you were in Paris and you needed a military target, where you don't look at the civilians on that side as people who hate me or people who I hate or people with whom I'm in a prolonged conflict? And I thought that was a really interesting thought, right? Do the Paris test in order to know whether you're acting out of revenge or you're acting out of proportionality, right? It's very interesting. I thought it was really thoughtful. Okay, so kinship ethics, international law, time for, you know how I'm going to say it? Who here thinks that God, belief in God, faith, is a source of deep particularism? Is a source of deep particularism? Don't be embarrassed. Nobody's looking. Just do it. Just do it. Oh, you don't understand the question. So let me explain it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Who here thinks that a belief in God, by definition, separates you from others? And I don't mean separates you as like believers, non-believers. I mean separates you as in, I'm this particularistic Jewish version of this, and the Jews we have our cocoon around us, and that cocoon separates us fundamentally from the rest of the world. So for whom does religion or God or faith do that in this room? Even if you don't go that far, Greg, you could still, I know what you mean. I up the ante a little bit. For whom here, yeah, it's like people are like afraid to raise their hand. Don't be afraid to raise your hand. You're having a disagreement. It's great. It's great. This is what it means to have a present. This is what it means to have a present. For who here is God the great universalizer? If I believe in God, I have to be thinking about my fellow human beings as my, Tselem Elokim, the image of God. Good, you raise your hand for both. It's perfect, right? So, by the way, I would raise my hand for both. The answer is both, right? Look at our liturgy. Look at our text. Of course, right? The Jewish people talks about its special covenant with God as something special. And there are times when God allows us to open the aperture and essentially say, well, God cares about all human beings. Shouldn't I? If God cares about all human beings, shouldn't I? So this is shared humanity. Shared humanity is the third. It's very, very, very hard to have shared humanity with people when you're in October 7th. I also want to say it's very, very hard to have shared humanity with people when you realize for how many people this is about 1948 and has nothing to do with occupation and has everything to do with trying to destroy the state of Israel. It's real. You see it in the streets. People who I was friends with, we don't talk anymore. We can't talk anymore. So this is hard. I'm not going to say it's not hard. But shared humanity is the bedrock of being human. And I would say as a person of faith, shared humanity is a bedrock of being a person of faith. So how do we hold on to it? So I think there are a few ways, right? But I'm going to talk about two. I want to take us to the Talmud in Sanhedrin 98b, number 6. The Talmud in Sanhedrin in this section is talking about the Messianic age. And you have, ultimate redemption of the world. Sounds like something you would want to see, right? I think we're kind of desperate for a redeemed world right now. And yet you have rabbi after rabbi saying, I hope it comes, but I don't want to be there to see it. Take a look at this one, number 6, Rabbi Yochanan from our earlier story. V'chein amar Rabbi Yochanan also said, Yetze v'lo achamine. I hope the Messiah comes, but I never meet them. Why? Mishum dichtiv, because it is written in Jeremiah, Sha'alu na u're'u, ask and look, im yoled zachar, do men give birth? And if not, madua ra'iti kol gever yadav al chalatzav ki yoleda? How come I see all of these men holding their hands on their hips like they're giving birth? This is my favorite part of the whole session. Just doing that. Also, it's very relaxing. It's, you know what I mean? It's like you're sitting, I'm standing. It's very nice, right? Why are they all holding their hands on their hips like they're giving birth? And not only that, v'ne'afchu kol panim li'yerakon, and their faces are turning green if they don't give birth. So the Gemara says, this pasuk, this verse explains to us why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't want to see the Messiah come. My ra'iti kol gever, what does it mean? I see every man, meaning I see every man with his hands on his hips. Amar Rava bar Yitzchak, Amar Rav, Rava the son of Yitzchak said in the name of Rav, it's not I saw every man, it's actually a stand-in for mi shekol gvura shelo, the one who has all the, not gever, man, but gvura, strength. And who is that? God, as though God lives right up there, right? God is a tenant on the second floor in this building, right? Mi shekol gvura shelo, I see God, meaning God is holding God's hands on God's hips in pain, okay? And what does it mean? And all of the faces have turned green. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says this refers to Pamalia Shel Mala Upamalia Shel Mata. This refers to God's entourage. Bisha'ah she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when God says, Halalu ma'aseh yadai v'halalu ma'aseh yadai. These are my handiwork, and these are my handiwork. He'ech abed elu mipnei elu. How am I going to let these perish in order to save those? What they're seeing in a redemptive moment is a zero-sum game. Some people winning and some people losing. Some people living and some people dying. And the description here is that God is sad about this. God is angry about this, but also doesn't stop it. There are times when it is a zero-sum game. We try to the best of our ability not to make it that. But there are times, and the answer is not to ignore the suffering. It's to be sad. It is. It's children, babies. And yet, we need to defend ourselves. That is, and we should feel it in there. And I know it's because Hamas embeds themselves. I know, we know all the things. But it's sad. It's tragic. And I don't think we should forget that. That's a shared humanity. The second piece. So what do you do about this shared humanity? So we have shared humanity, and yet we have zero-sum moments. And this is why I built it on kinship ethics. Kinship ethics, I gotta protect my own. International law, I gotta follow international law and try to be moral. On a gut level, I have to also recognize that it is sad that there is suffering among people who are uninvolved and people who did not celebrate October 7th. Babies, they didn't celebrate October 7th. And I don't know a member of the IDF from my family or friends who doesn't feel that. I don't. And they want to feel that because that's their humanity and they don't want it to slip away. But I want to talk about realism in terms of building bridges. I have seen in the last several months my bridges turn to footbridges, okay? I really, really cherish the footbridges. The footbridges are people who understand me and I understand them. The bridges that have been broken are people who refuse to have a shared humanity or have turned. And I think something that has, fueled me for a long time, ever since I read this or learned this, is this exchange of letters between Professor Samuel Bergman, or Hugo Bergman, who was the director of the National Library of Israel from 1920 to 1935, before it was a state, and Professor Nechama Leibovitz, who was a signature Bible educator in Israel, who really got a whole certain way of thinking about Bible and its relevance to the Jewish people and to the Jewish experience off the ground in Israel. In 1957, Bergman heard Leibovitz on the, your alarm's going off. Bergman heard Leibovitz, it's like a subtle hint, but not so subtle, do a talk on the radio, okay? She did a Parsha, weekly portion on the radio every week. How sweet is that? And on the radio, she was talking about Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esav. And she said, well, this is how it's always gonna be, Yaakov and Esav. That's how it's gonna be. Don't be naive, that's how it's gonna be. And Bergman, who's one of the founders of Brit Shalom, the Brit Shalom movement, of like a binational Jewish state, he wrote her a letter. And in his letter, he says as follows. We're on number 7. He says, Hineni margish chova lomar lach. I feel like I need to tell you, kamat sa'ar garamt li, how much pain you caused me. Al yedei ha-perush l'sipur al pkishat Yaakov ve'esav. Based on your interpretation about the story of Yaakov and Esav meeting up again after being away from each other for a couple of decades. Nivhalti likro, I was shocked to read, and this is also in her weekly Gilyon, her weekly newsletter, Ki chol asher era la'avinu im Esav, everything that happened to our father Jacob with Esau, ye'era lanu tamid im bnei Esav, will always happen to us with the children of Esav, which of course is symbolically, it's a symbol for our foes in the world. V'nivhalti od yoter, and I was even more shocked, lishmoa dvarayach b'shidur, to hear your words on the radio, ve'et ha'ofen shebo ha'emadet mul perusho shel Hirsch, et perusho shel Yaakov, v'gamart bazeh. I was also shocked by the fact that you left Samson Raphael Hirsch's explanation, which was much more sort of humanistic, and instead went with Benno Jacob's interpretation. By the way, when was the last time that you wrote into somebody when you heard their Torah and you were like, listen, That version of your Torah, I'm not into it, and I want to talk to you about it on a moral level. Rabbis, would you love it? It
happens every time.
Does it happen every time? You got proof? I can also get some, right? Great. So he really took this seriously. Why? He says, Ha'ein at mivina, thank you. Do you not understand? She'at zorat sin'a la'adam b'lev halomdim v'hashomim? Don't you realize you are sowing hatred in the hearts of your learners and of your listeners? Don't you realize that you're sowing hatred? That's what he's upset about. We have a sovereign state. You can't talk like that. You can't. And she writes back. Now, I'm giving you like the shortest version. Email me. I'll send you the whole thing in English. So she says, "Kemo she'ani ro'a kechovati," just as I see as my responsibility, lahavlit le'enei talmidai, to show and make clear to the eyes of my students, et kol hakilkulim v'ashrituyot, all of the corruption, and sarut ha'ayin v'halev, and narrowness of eye and heart, v'hashitchiyut, and the superficiality, v'hachikui shel ha'mekulkalim shebeumot ha'olam b'medinatenu, and copying the worst of among the behaviors in our own state of Israel, just as I point that out to my learners, v'im kol zeh lo ya'aleh al da'ati, it would never enter my mind, even though I'm criticizing my own state, she'eni mechanechet le'ne'emanut u'li'avat Yisrael le'artzo medinato, that I'm not telling these people they should love Israel. Reshit ge'ulatenu, the beginning of our redemption. Hein gam atam taskimi mi, maybe you'll also agree with me, she'en lechanech le'avat ha'adam b'asher hu adam, you should not teach people love of people for its own sake, u'v'tikva la'acharit hayamim, with a hope for, sort of the riding off into the sunset, toch hastarat kol asher alalu lanu v'ashkachat advarim. You shouldn't just pretend the things they did to us didn't happen. You can hold both. You can go into relationships, the footbridges, the humanity, without ignoring the fact that some of these people hate us. Many of these people hate us. And many people around the world also hate us and also hate the state of Israel. And many people around the world love us and love the state of Israel. Shared humanity that is realistic. We do not give up on our own history and the knowledge that it is possible for us to become endangered because we hold some beautiful dream of a utopian shared humanity. And we do not give up on our humanity because we are endangered. How to hold both is the work of application, similar to figuring out proportionality. But being able to say, I want to hold both. I want to have a realism and a humanism together is a first step. What I've given you here, and then I'm going to open up for questions, is something that I hope is very clear, something that I hope could be challenging, could be affirming, but it's present, and it's thinking, and it allows for people to disagree, and it's not hysterical, and it's not ignoring reality at the same time. And I would say, as I close, what I actually hope most of all, in terms of what I presented here, is that I did a service that my family member who is fighting in Gaza, that he would be proud of, that he would feel supported by, that he would basically agree with. And that is because the foundation for me, betoch ami anochi yoshavet. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Let's do it.
Hi.
Hi.
What I find interesting is my parents were survivors, so I'm a child of survivors. And I think even among Jewish people, what triggers us the most, I think, depends on our own personal experiences and our history. So among my friends, which I have friends who are Jewish, who are not Jewish, who are Jewish and don't have my history, and friends who have my history, that the trauma is more pronounced and more, how can I say it, reactive among children of survivors. And I don't understand how we can, it's very difficult to look at the current situation, look at October 7th, without, my mother had 3 children who were shot in front of her eyes, and Hamas came in and did the same thing, shot children in front of their parents. So to me, there's a difference between an enemy who you have a different territorial dispute with, or many wars where there's different political disputes. And to me, this is kind of a war. I wouldn't say that it's between good and evil, but between human and an evil ideology. So for me, I have absolutely no qualms about this war. I do agree children are innocent, absolutely. But I think that the Jewish reaction itself also depends on our history.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. And I actually think that's not something to be pushed aside. I think that's important collective memory and collective muscle reflex. The question is twofold, I think. One, for people who don't have that collective, that muscle reflex, and maybe also there's a generational difference, right? Then how do you still be in conversation with each other about this, right? And then the second thing is you'll notice that my conversation here centered around how to fight a war justly, not a question of whether fighting the war is just. I am taking for granted that fighting a war against a genocidal enemy is just. I then want to talk about, within that war, what is animating decision-making, right? So I think that's also in response, but I really appreciate that. And the trauma, I mean, I'm not from survivor family directly, and secondhand, I could feel that trauma. All you had to do was read, and we visited the camps, and meaning, you know what it is when someone puts you know what it is.
Yeah, and I have to say, for me personally, that doesn't mean that you go in and you kill I don't want us to be evil.
You want the war to be fought justly.
I want a war to be fought justly and won by the Israelis.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it. It's that simple.
You know, can I tell you something? This is what we say in our home every night with my family. I mean, not tonight because I'm not here. So we pray, like we'll say a chapter of Psalms, and then we'll say, may the armed forces of Israel be safe, may they win, may the hostages return, and may innocents, wherever they are, be protected. And in that order. Well, so it's we want to win, right? Winning is eradicating Hamas, destroying all the tunnels. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's not easy. It's a lot. Thank you.
Do you think Hamas cares that the IDF is fighting a just war? The more deaths on the Palestinian side, the better their cause.
Right. I think they care. They care because it works to their advantage.
Exactly. It's a very cynical exercise. So why do we worry about conducting a just war?
So I think we worry about conducting a just war because we don't want to become them. I think that's why. Meaning, we don't want to become them. How to not become them when fighting them. I understand. I really understand what you're saying. I really understand what you're saying. But we can't become them.
So I'll take one of the suppositions you made,
Yeah.
that proportionate could be what it would take to ultimately defeat the enemy, in this case Hamas. And what if, and this is going to be shocking, it took the complete destruction of human life in Gaza to get Hamas defeated? Is that trump the other, obviously, positions that you took?
Do you think, let's give a historical analog. Is the bombing of Dresden an analog to what you're saying? Or no, because it's not wiping out everybody?
Yeah.
Hiroshima.
Yeah. It's the only way to have, if it was true that the only way the Americans could have defeated the Japanese in World War II, and I'm not saying it's true, okay? So in either case, I'm saying it's true, but just as a theoretical.
Right, such a macabre, sad question.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, and I'm going to treat it with severity because it's a fair question. I'm going to say two things. Number one, I think that you want to err on the side of that not being the only way to defeat Hamas. I said you want to err on the side of that not being the only way to defeat Hamas. And number two, I think that the day after and the years after is also part of what it means to defeat Hamas. And I think that if you obliterate any chance of a day after, you probably aren't going to defeat Hamas. Again, I don't know if we're going to defeat Hamas this way either. It's an ideology, right? But I think both of those are aspects that I would take into account in terms of your question.
Thank you.
If that's helpful. Thank you. Wow, I am not going to want this recording up on the internet. I just want to say, I'm just realizing this is not going up on the internet. Yes.
So I'd like to go back to your opening.
Well, also, I just want to say something. I'm so sorry. One of the reasons I'm a little self-conscious, instead of thinking about this later, I actually want to think about this with you now. I almost cried at certain points, and then I cried when I was talking about civilians on the other side. And I want to explain that crying in the following two ways. It's actually important for me to explain that crying. That crying is a cumulative crying from everything that I said tonight. It contains within it all of it. The soldiers, the hostages, the ICJ, the ripping down of posters, young fathers dying in service of their country, and civilians on the other side. And the second thing is, I don't want to just pay lip service to what I think is actually a moral stance, which is that sometimes things are a zero-sum game and you have to do them and you still can be sad about it. And it can still be tragic because that's what real life can be sometimes. So thanks, I just had to do that. Hi.
Hi. So I want to go back to your opening level of kinship and the statement on the Yoshev B'toch Ami. I'm not sure if I understood you saying that in time of war, it's no longer appropriate to criticize Israel, that we have to stand in solidarity. And if that's the case, does that also apply not to criticize settlers who are engaging in violence on the West Bank that's making it more difficult for us to justify Israel's position in the world opinion?
Thank you. That's a really great question. I want to distinguish between a default orientation and an activity. A default orientation of critique is that the first thing I look for are the critical messages, and that's what I send out. A default orientation of support and holding is I look for ways that when the Israeli gaze hits whatever it is that I'm messaging, they think, wow, that person's there for me. That does not mean that I can't engage in the activity of criticizing, but I don't want that to be the main orientation, okay? So it's a balance that people have to figure out. But the second thing is, I think that Walzer, for example, saying that he wouldn't write a piece without Avishai Margalit on these issues, because he's not going to write it as an American without an Israeli counterpart, there's a lot of power to that, because it means you're actually supporting voices from within rather than being someone who conveniently is not in harm's way in the same way, leveling those critiques. Now, when it comes to settler violence, I think that part of the conversation about the day after, and even part of the conversation about international law, very relevant here, right? Itamar Ben-Gvir has created his own militias of settlers to whom he's given guns to do who knows what to who knows who, right? That's very scary and problematic, morally and legally problematic, right? So something needs to be done. I have to ask myself as a Canadian, I'm half Canadian, I have to ask myself as a Canadian, how do I raise my voice about that so that it's betoch ami anochi yoshavet, right? I think it's really important. Thank you. Yes. Oh, wait, we need to get you a mic.
The issue of the settlers comes into the realm that the government has to support Shelanu. So how do we play with that? On one hand, we have to support our own. On the other hand, I don't want to support them.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Can I ask you where you're from originally? Because that's not a Canadian accent.
I am from Argentina.
Okay, I was hoping you were going to say Israeli, because that would have been more fun, but Argentina's great too. They're very good steak, I think. So I think that when we say that we're here for our people, it does not mean that everything that our people does is okay and that we want to legitimize that, right? So the question really is, who's in our alliance from within our people to be able to stand up and offer a different vision and challenge the vision that we see, right? You do hear growing voices in Israel now about these things as we see a little bit more politicking coming from the government around issues of the war, which can be problematic, right? Blaming and people are standing up and saying, no, this is not what should be done, right? So I like to connect up with those voices. That, it's a similar answer. It's the question of, how do you connect with people who are the loyal opposition, so to speak, right? Being the loyal... Well, I think loyal in the sense of loyal to the Jewish people and to its future, right? You can find a lot of people who would want to fight settler violence who don't care about Israel or have antipathy towards it, right? Those are not my people. Those are not my allies. Even if, from a utilitarian standpoint, you can get something done. And I think a lot of people, by the way, saw that after October 7th. People who they thought were their allies in fighting occupation, they thought were their allies in bringing more human rights, were actually against the state of Israel. And that's what they found out. And that was a really, really rude awakening for people who were trying to do something they felt was just.
May I add something?
Yes.
The issue of the kids of Asaph will be our enemies forever. Imagine the Palestinians that are in Gaza. They will be forever. The kids of those people will be our enemies.
Well, so it's really interesting. I've been listening a lot to Israel Policy Forum during this time. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but my friend Michael Koplow is a columnist for it. He's also a Hartman fellow in New York. And they have a really interesting 5 suggestions for a plan for Gaza after the war. And part of the key is a re-education, right? a re-education of Gazan children, a re-education. Is it possible? I don't know. Do we have an alternative? Not really, right? So I think what you're saying is quite profound, which is if people are going to brainwash people into a militaristic and even anti-Semitic and genocidal ideology, right, starting from a young age, that's what they're going to become for the most part, right? Is there a way to break that cycle educationally? Certainly the UNRWA schools are not doing that, right? So who can? Can anyone? Will anyone? I think that's the big question.
Thank you. It was very insightful, but I would disagree with the fact that the Palestinians can be our enemies forever. And I follow Elon Levy, who's a spokesperson for the government of Israel. And in one of the interviews, he said...
The best meme with Elon Levy.
Incredible.
Have you seen it?
No.
This is great. It has 9 facial expressions of Elon Levy on the BBC. Which expression does he have on today? And you have everything from to, like that. But yes, Elon Levy, I'm a fan.
No, but in one interview, his concept was, in response to an interviewer, said that Israel would like to have Gaza to be as prosperous as Germany is today after the Second World War. And I think there's a possibility, there's a glimpse of possibility that Gaza would be a great neighbor like Germany turned out to be after World War.
Here's what I would say. Shared humanity, realistic. Realistic shared humanity. How do you do it? People are going to have different opinions. They're going to have different ways that they're going to go. As long as we're not Pollyannish and we're really trying to work on things in a sustained way, I'm on board. Even if I don't agree with the particular direction, I'm on board as a moral approach. That's what I would say. Do we have another?
We have one question on the live stream.
Oh, wow.
So if you're okay with that.
Yeah, of course.
From
really
Ezra.
There. Hi, Ezra.
Hamas is a totalitarian state and can coerce its entire population, for example, using Arab workers from Gaza in Israel to spy. Do not the laws of war change to take this circumstance into account?
Okay, so you would have to ask an international lawyer. I'm going to speak as a Talmudic lawyer. We have a rule in the Talmud that if somebody tells you to kill someone innocent or they will kill you, you have to let them kill you. I am not morally compelled by the argument that somebody was willing to give information about the layout of kibbutzim and didn't give anyone a heads up that they had done that because they were scared of Hamas. To me, that is not an uninvolved person. That is my answer as a religious person. That is not my answer as an international lawyer, because I'm not one. Thanks, Ezra. Good question.
Great. We'll do one final question.
Yes, my question is, I've heard a lot of discussion about the issue of a non-combatant, what they believe and what they celebrate, and what impact that has on their innocence, and the idea of, like, if somebody celebrates an atrocity, does it make them any less innocent or deserving of protection in war? And my question is, do you think it makes any difference at all?
My understanding is that from an international law standpoint, unless somebody is involved in carrying out some form of combat, be it holding someone prisoner or actively attacking someone, they are not a legitimate target. In terms of the questions like Margalit and Kasher were arguing over, which is how much danger do I want Israeli soldiers to be in to save people like that? Well, I already said that I side more with Kasher and Yadlin generally. So it's basically partially because of that. That's what I would say. But other people will disagree with me, including Walzer and Margalit and Halbertal and plenty of people who raised their hand in this room. Both moral perspectives. It's not an easy situation. So I want to thank everybody very much for being here. You know, it's very sobering times. And I am just going to end with how the Israelis end, which is Besorot Tovot. May we hear better news. Thank you.
Ilana, it has been freezing here for days. You have warmed us up. And even though gray is very great today still, many of us are still on October 7th, and we're still stopped there. Anytime I learn from you, I always take a nugget with me. And I think today's nugget is B'toch Ameinu Anachnu Yoshvim. And I want to look at that on two levels. One is Betzedek and Holy Blossom are here together at Holy Blossom. This is Ameinu. You asked us how it was before. This is real, you know? We're all here together, and hopefully, God willing, on January 27th, on Shabbat Shira, we'll go a block south for the song circle for Shabbat Shira, featuring many of our musical leaders at 7:30. That was the plug. But aside from that, I think B'toch Ameinu Anachnu Yoshvim, we are sitting within our people. That's why we cry when we see those videos of the fathers coming back to their children and meeting them in their schools, or the Saba and the Savta seeing the soldier. That's why when we see this week Matisyahu is at army bases, we get emotional when he sings his song One Day, or when we saw Aviv Alush or Omer Adam or any of these guys who are doing what Bob Hope did, because we're all together. And so, you know, thank you for providing us the language for that to answer the question when people say, how are you doing? I think that's going to be my new answer. And I think for many of us, that's going to be our new answer. B'toch Ameinu Anachnu Yoshvim, we are sitting with our people. I want to plug your new book that's coming out. I'm not sure how to get it in Canada yet. Wait a little bit. And you have a new podcast coming out, too. The new podcast is called?
It's called Texting. And it's called Texting, and the first one comes out tomorrow. And I invite other Hartman scholars to talk about Torah that is relevant to challenges of this moment.
Kol HaKavod. It is always a pleasure to learn with you and learn from you. And a reminder for the teens, you have something special now with Ilana. Kol HaKavod, and thank you.